let's level with each other. I don't think it's anything new to say that the majority of 2020 has sucked. But there's a huge difference between a year positively sucking and a year being downright catastrophic. In fact, CDC Director Robert Redfield stated that the fall and winter of 2020 and 2021 are probably going to be one of the most difficult times that we have experienced. And while we've had many difficult times, especially in recent years, we've definitely had a whole lot of catastrophic years over human existence. So, what was the worst year in human history? I decided to talk to a number of historians and have them pitch to me what they believe the worst year ever was, and how that compares with 2020. Before we begin, let me mention that we obviously can't cover every terrible year, and the ones that we are looking at are based entirely upon the subjectivity of the following historians. However, if you'd like to nominate your own terrible year, sound off in the comments below. So what makes a bad year catastrophic?
If you, for example, take a time machine, which years would you try to avoid, for example, if you could travel back in time?
To help our historians pitch their worst years, we'll be looking at them through these categories. 1. The events that took place. What exactly happened that year? Was it political strife, natural disasters, a war against emus? See Australian history for reference, folks. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. 2. The global scope of the events. Was it just bad in one area, or was the year bad across the globe? Finally, 3. Historical impact, aka why we're still talking about it today. Now that that's out of the way, let's introduce our historians and the years that they're pitching. Representing the year 536, we have Michael Siegel, a paleoclimatologist at the University of Bern in Switzerland. 1348 is being presented by Alex Moore, assistant research professor for the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine and a research associate at Harvard University. Moving along, we have 1492, as presented by associate professor of history Peter Schulman from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And our final year is 1890, as told by Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair of American History at the University of Connecticut. For the sake of history, let's duke this out chronologically. The first year on our list is 536, a climate disaster that left much of the world in complete darkness.
That is largely considered by climate scientists as the coldest year on record. So over the last 2,500 years, there hasn't been any other single year that was as cold as this year here. It was more or less the onset of a long-lasting cold spell, which lasted then for several decades, up to a century, and which was later then even called the Late Antique Little Ice Age.
And an ice age it was. A mysterious fog plunged Europe, the Middle East, and Asia into darkness for nearly 18 months.
So, believed to be 2 large volcanic eruptions. So one in 536 and another one in 540.
It initiated the coldest decade of the past 2,300 years, resulting in snow in the summer in China, huge crop failures, and mass starvations, including a bread failure in Ireland.
With a very strong cooling and very poor climate conditions, causing famines, and people had no idea what it was.
In 536, it didn't matter where you were. From Mesoamerica to the Far East, global temperatures were down 3 degrees. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote this about the sunlight during 536. And if that doesn't illustrate the doom and gloom of this year, I don't know what does. Moving past the little ice age of 536, we approach 1348. The Black Death was a devastating global epidemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe and Asia beginning in 1348.
Bring out Cheddar!
It creates an infection in the body that enlarges your glands under your armpits and under your throat and the groin. And it creates carbuncles, as they're known, which then become black. They're filled with all sorts of wonderful liquids.
The Black Death was an especially virulent plague that had a death rate upwards of 60%.
Imagine the map of the United States and black out everything, west of Illinois, west of Missouri. That's significant. It becomes a very lonely world.
The Black Death was spread through the air and worked so fast that healthy people could go to sleep fine and be dead by the morning.
The 1348 to 1353 are usually the years we think this pandemic really lasted and made a huge dent in the population and the economy and the environment, but it continued for centuries.
The plague outbreak of 1348, by the end of its 5-year terror, had claimed nearly 1/3 of the population of Europe, or roughly 20 million lives.
We should really value the experience of past societies because they went through it for much longer than us. 1348 is the worst year because half of people dying makes for a very lonely world.
Moving further in our timeline brings us to the third entry on our list, 1492. Most school children are taught that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but what came after that is usually left out.
So 1492 is the worst year because it's a moment when peoples around the world come together and it results in enslavement and disease and conquest. Events of that year just triggered this kind of cascade of terrible things. This kind of leads to this, colonial empire in the New World, genocide of Native American civilizations, and because of labor needs, the importation of vast numbers of African slaves into the New World. It's just terrible. Over time, probably wipes out as much as 90% of the total pre-Columbian population of the Americas, which is like a mind-boggling figure.
On a global scale, Columbus's GPS blunder isn't the only catastrophic event to occur. Another large-scale event during the year included Spain passing its Alhambra decree, which expelled their entire Jewish population.
The consequences of 1492 are vast and terrible, and I think really global in scope. And 5 centuries later, we're still living with the consequences.
Moving to the 19th century, we arrive at a year where, according to expert Manisha Sinha, the world was in shambles.
The 1890s becomes a really bad time period, especially if you were a person of color, if you were African American, or even if you were just an ordinary worker in the United States.
Following the Civil War, the United States entered what is now known as Reconstruction, in which the nation worked to reintegrate southern states into the reforming nation. One of the biggest hurdles of this time period was ensuring the rights of newly liberated Black Americans. Federal troops were based all over the ex-Confederacy to ensure that these rights were being fulfilled.
You have Black senators, you have Black governors, you have Black congressmen.
Unfortunately, this practice was entirely overthrown in 1877 when troops were pulled from the South.
There's a compromise where the federal government decides to take away federal troops from the South and basically not enforce Black rights in the South anymore.
Though Reconstruction ended in 1877, Manisha chose 1890 as the worst year in history due to a set of laws introduced as a result of Reconstruction turbulence. The Mississippi Plan used the law to actively disenfranchise Black voters in Mississippi and re-establish white supremacy in the South. This is the birth to Jim Crow era laws and the precursor to 1896's Plessy versus Ferguson, the ruling that allowed racial segregation in the South. The effects of this are obviously still felt to this day. However, 1890 was also a terrible year on a global scale.
You have what is known as the scramble for Africa amongst European nations, and they colonized pretty much the entire continent except for Ethiopia and Liberia, which is an American colony. All the European powers want their colonies in Africa and they want to mine the riches. In 1890, Europeans moved towards actually directly ruling Africa, annexing and forming their own colonies, which leads to imperialism and to the colonization of Africa, feeds into the First World War. Because Germany wants a place in the sun too, as they put it.
At the time, this was referred to as the white man's burden.
It was an ideology like racism that masks the reality, which was really the Black man's burden, right?
The list could go on and on depending on which historian you ask. So here are some other noteworthy nominees. 1816. Known as the year without a summer, it's when Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted, spewing millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere and causing effects felt the world over. 1918. This year marked the spread of the Spanish influenza, which infected an estimated 500 million people between 1918 and 1919. It claimed about 50 million deaths worldwide. 1943. By 1943, the Holocaust was reaching its peak. An estimated 1.2 million Jewish people had been deported from Nazi-occupied lands, many of them sent to death camps. All the while, Allied powers didn't yet have the military capacity or the political will to stop the carnage in Germany. 1968 was a tumultuous year for sure, seeing the stalemate of the Vietnam War, the election of Nixon, and both the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. But what about 2020? The coronavirus pandemic alone gives 2020 a good case. As of July, 16.3 million people have been infected and 650,000 have died. It's also devastated global economies that will likely impact the world for years to come. Additionally, Australia faced devastation as bushfires threatened the south coast of the country in New South Wales. Over 1 billion animals were believed to have died in the fires. 2020 has also shown an international spotlight on police brutality. Following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, protests have sparked globally in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and to actively hold police accountable and funnel resources into communities rather than into law enforcement. So which do you think was the worst year ever? Was it 536's volcanic disruptions? Or was it 1348's plague epidemic? What about 1492's global conquest that forever changed history as we know it? Maybe it was 1890's globally racist tactics of oppression and colonization. Let's face it, humanity has faced some downright terrible years. So when you think about the doom and gloom of 2020, don't dwell on how bad it is. Persevere, and in the great human tradition, survive, and help those around you survive, because there's progress to be made on the other side of this. And like I said, if you want to name a year that none of our historians have covered, sound off in the comments below. Let's get a conversation going. As always, be safe and thanks for watching.